Hello, my name is Philip Allen, and I would like to talk with you today about psychological factors associated with Chiari malformation. The goal of this discussion is to integrate some research that my colleagues and I have been doing over the last 8 years or 10 years, depending on how you figure it. Before we go any farther, I would like to thank my collaborators in this endeavor, and that foremost would be Frank Loth, also Rick Labuda, and Mark Luciano, Charles Vorster, and Petra Klinge. Without them, this would not have been possible. Let's begin by discussing allostatic load in Chiari malformation. Allostatic load was a model developed by Bruce McEwen initially in 1998, and many Chiari malformation patients experience both acute or short-term and chronic or long-term stress from pain and disability related to Chiari. Allostatic load is the body's ability to secrete stress hormones to cope with acute stress. However, with chronic stress due to psychosocial and physical stressors, allostatic load may overwhelm the capability of biological mechanisms to cope with this stress, particularly the neuroprotective hormone of estrogen. The goal of this presentation is to review several psychological variables that have been shown to be associated with Chiari malformation. So we'll go over evidence for allostatic load, cognitive effects, depression, anxiety, and stress, pain in several categories, and neuroimaging. Allostatic load in the HPA axis. And by the way, HPA refers to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So our bodies have an internal system involving the brain and endocrine system that protects us from external and internal threats or stressors. This system works effectively for acute or short-term situations and responding to threats, and is anti-inflammatory at that level. However, when the external and internal threats continue over a long period of time, that is, become chronic, then the HPA axis becomes pro-inflammatory. And markers for the HPA axis are cortisol, a stress hormone, and interleukin-6 or IL-6, an inflammatory marker for infections, anxiety, and stress. Estrogen is a neuroprotective hormone in both women and men that helps reduce inflammation, especially during chronic external or internal stressors. Estrogen is a key factor in allostasis by preventing stressors from inducing a pro-inflammatory response that is harmful when it becomes chronic response. So in Garcia et al. 2021, we conducted a biomarker study using decompressed and non-decompressed Chiari patients. So we collected assays, both saliva or salivary, and blood serum assays, saliva for cortisol and serum assays for interleukin-6 and estrogen. And we won't go into the details about how it is very important to make sure everyone is at the same point in their estrogen cycle. All of these participants were females, adult females in this study. We had 43 decompressed individuals and 19 non-decompressed Chiari malformation patients, and they were all assessed for the effects of surgical status and the UCLA loneliness score. And the UCLA loneliness test is a measure of social isolation. And these three biomarkers. So the hypothesis was that decompression and high loneliness would combine to stress the system more than either one in isolation. So non-decompressed and low loneliness should result in less of an HPA axis response. And we're going to measure the HPA axis response in our presentation today with cortisol. And we're going to measure the biological resilience response to that of estrogen using estrogen. So the real challenge will be when we have both decompression and high loneliness to see if the system can deal with that. And if allostatic load becomes too high, then estrogen levels should drop relative to the lower stress conditions. That is, the neuroprotective system would be overwhelmed. Now, the figure on the next page illustrates our results. For decompressed patients, cortisol levels increased with increasing loneliness. But for non-decompressed patients, cortisol levels did not change with increased levels of loneliness. However, for estrogen, keeping in mind that cortisol is measuring the initial HPA axis and estrogen levels are the biological resilience estrogen hormone that comes in and tries to make up for the high levels of HPA axis in chronic conditions. So decompressed patients actually in this study showed a significant drop in estrogen levels as isolation increased. But for non-decompressed patients, there was an upward trend in estrogen levels as isolation increased. So let's move on to this next slide and look at this. So the dark line is non-decompressed. The gray line is decompressed. And the figure on the left is for cortisol, and the figure on the right is for estrogen. And our independent variables are surgical status and loneliness level. This is low loneliness, this is high loneliness. Low loneliness, high loneliness. And what we see is that for non-decompressed Chiari malformation patients, this difference is not significant. So even though it looks like it goes down, it's actually flat. On the other hand, the cortisol secretion goes up for people with low loneliness compared to high loneliness. So loneliness levels for non-decompressed people don't seem to overwhelm the system enough to have a threat response. But you have an increase in the threat response as loneliness increases for cortisol for decompressed Chiari patients, the ones with some more severe compression. On the other hand, for estrogen, you see a very different pattern. For non-decompressed, you see a trend toward an increase in estrogen release as you go from low loneliness to high loneliness. But you see something very different for decompressed Chiari patients' data. You see a statistically significant drop in estrogen. And that is the classical pattern that you would expect. An increase in cortisol with loneliness, but a decrease in estrogen for loneliness for decompressed individuals as evidence of allostatic overload. So the neuroprotective hormone estrogen it was overwhelmed and collapsed and couldn't deal with the combined effects of decompression and high loneliness. So now we have a biomarker model of allostatic overload in Chiari malformation. Now, let's go over cognitive effects in Chiari malformation. So one of the most commonly reported effects from self-report in Chiari patients is something along the lines of brain fog. And in these studies, we looked at it more precisely in terms of different types of cognitive tasks. And this could be due to chronic pain, or it could be separate from that. In fact, later on, I'm going to argue that it's both of them that results in these cognitive effects. So what we're testing is whether there's cognitive dysfunction associated with Chiari malformation. We had 24 Chiari patients that were decompressed and 24 age and education matched controls that were healthy. And we measured them on several cognitive tasks. And what we found is that, in fact, Chiari patients showed much larger Stroop interference effects for the color task, slower processing speed, and in both the digit symbol and working memory tasks. So overall, we did find cognitive dysfunction in Chiari patients relative controls in this 2014 study. Then we followed that up in a 2019 study, except this time we used a standardized neuropsychological assessment battery, the so-called R-bands battery. And we had 18 Chiari patients that were about to be decompressed and 18 healthy controls. And we tested them on the R-bands. And the R-bands has 5 domains. It has immediate and delayed memory. It has visuospatial construction, language, and attention, and then a combined or total score. And on this study, CM patients showed significantly poor performance on immediate and delayed memory, as well as attention and total scores. And there was a strong trend toward the effect of visuospatial construction. The only one that wasn't significant was language that we can see here. There was no hint of an effect between Chiari patients and controls. But for immediate memory, delayed memory, attention, and total score, there were very large effects. So there is conclusive evidence for cognitive dysfunction associated with Chiari malformation. It occurs for processing speed, it occurs for attention and inhibitory control, as well as immediate and delayed memory. Also, in terms of psychological variables affected by Chiari malformation are depression, anxiety, and stress. Garcia et al. 2019 assessed a fairly large sample of over 1,000 Chiari patients from the Conquer Chiari Chiari 1000 database. So we needed to increase that number over 1,000 as these data attest. And a little over half of them were decompressed, and a few under half were non-decompressed. And we tested them on the DAS-21, the depression, anxiety, and stress scale. And we observed that 60% of the sample both decompressed and non-decompressed, showed moderate to severe levels of anxiety, and 44% showed moderate to severe levels of depression. So very high levels of anxiety and depression then in this Chiari sample. So these overall results show that Chiari patients have significantly higher anxiety and depression scores than the population as a whole. Now, pain and Chiari malformation. Now, classically, Chiari malformation has acute pain from a so-called pressure headache or Valsalva headache. In fact, about 70% or more, maybe as high as 90% of Chiari malformation patients show headache pain, and 60% or more show neck pain. However, a high percentage of Chiari malformation patients also experience chronic headaches as well as acute pressure headaches. And we have shown that there are interventions for pain for people with Chiari malformation that have chronic pain. And Holmes et al. In 2019, we showed that on a pilot study that acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT therapy, showed very positive evidence of being effective over 12 in-person sessions. And in fact, Doug Delahanty is working on an online version of this as well. So at the present point in time, the most effective intervention for learning how to cope with pain and Chiari is acceptance and commitment therapy. We have also studied the personality effects of pain on Chiari malformation patients. In a 2018 paper, we studied slightly over 600 Chiari patients, about half decompressed and half non-decompressed, and we looked at reflection, which is a personality variable that is based on self-focused attention, and it's indexed by the rumination and reflection questionnaire. We also collected data on pain using the McGill Pain Questionnaire, and we examined surgical status, decompressed versus non-decompressed, and looked at the effect of those three variables on delayed recall memory using a modified version of the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Task. So what we found is that in general, people with Chiari malformation showed significantly poorer delayed recall than healthy controls. But the main part of this study found that there is an interaction, a reflection by pain by surgical status interaction. And I'll show you this effect illustrated. So we have decompressed patients on the left, non-decompressed on the right, and we didn't really find evidence of individual differences in reflection helping people deal better with high pain levels, so low and high pain. It was flat across all of the data points. But for non-decompressed patients, we saw a decrease in memory recall. So memory recall here is on the y-axis and pain levels are on the x-axis. And then we have low reflection in black and high reflection in gray. So what we found is that for low levels of pain, people with high self-focused attention or high reflection, individual differences where they were really good at focusing on their own bodily states, they actually recalled significantly more than at low pain levels than people with low reflection. But no one was effective in dealing with memory at high levels of pain. So what these results suggest is that there actually is a benefit for your ability of self-focused attention in blocking what we would call the prepotent effect of pain from interfering with your everyday functioning. And finally, with regard to pain, we looked at morphometrics in pain in Garcia et al. 2022. I might note that the earlier Garcia is Monica Garcia, and this Garcia is Maitani Garcia. So they're two different Garcias. We assessed 300 adult Chiari patients. 80% of them were female, and about half and half decompressed versus non-decompressed. This time, though, we actually looked at morphometric measures for each participant derived from structural MRIs. And this sample was between 18 and 60 years of age, and we assessed pain using the same McGill Pain Questionnaire short form, the revised version. Now, one morphometric measure, anterior CSF space, and we will, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this figure on the left, area number 7, highlighted in green, illustrates the area of anterior CSF space. At the top, we have the foramen magnum, and at the bottom, we have C2, or the second cervical vertebra. And what we found is that this area of cerebral spinal fluid mediated the relationship between age and pain. Let's move on to pain and cognitive effects in Chiari malformation using diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI. The utility of DTI is that it allows us to assess white matter integrity of fiber tracts in the brain. In a 2020 study from Houston et al., we scanned 18 Chiari patients and 18 controls, and our main measure was fractional anisotropy, or FA for short. Chiari patients showed higher FA than controls, and this is somewhat surprising because FA is typically associated with less pathology rather than more. However, in cases of neural inflammation, such as what is likely the case in Chiari malformation, FA can go up because the compression from the inflammation prevents the water droplets from going in a different direction because of the inflammation. What we found was the left anterior limb of the internal capsule, which is connected to the anterior cingulate cortex, an area associated with pain processing, showed higher FA levels for Chiari patients than for controls. And this suggests that Chiari patients develop a so-called neuropathic pain network in an attempt to inhibit pain in the prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex area with little success. Also, there was a significant correlation between FA and the repeatable battery for assessment of neuropsychological status, or R-band's coding performance, a cognitive measure that was observed for controls but not for the Chiari group. And this implies that Chiari patients do not have an intact cognitive pathway associated with coding, at least to the extent that controls do. Controls. And finally, we have pain and cognitive effects in intrinsic functional connectivity as indexed by resting state fMRI. Now, DTI uses structural MRI, and it tells you whether two nodes are connected. But functional connectivity goes a step beyond and is designed to test whether the signal gets from one node to another. Not just that there's a connection, but the signal gets through. So in theory, there is an advantage to resting state fMRI to look at structural integrity and functional connectivity. And this paper, Houston et al. 2021, used that same sample of 18 Chiari patients and 18 controls, and there were age differences in functional connectivity that were identified. There were areas in which Chiari malformation patients showed less connectivity than controls, which we call hypoconnectivity, and other areas in which Chiari malformation patients showed increased connectivity or hyperconnectivity. And what was an interesting outcome of this study is that it appeared that hypoconnectivity was associated with cognitive dysfunction in Chiari patients, whereas hyperconnectivity was associated with pain effects. So it looks like that there are cases when there are cognitive deficits in Chiari that are independent of pain effects. Some cognitive effects are related to distraction by pain, but there are other cognitive effects that are associated with a loss of connectivity that is independent of pain, that is probably due to an inflammatory response or CSF pressure effects. We're not sure yet, but this is the first conclusive form of proof that there are independent cognitive effects on neural pathways from pain effects on neural pathways. Let's now summarize our results of psychological effects in Chiari malformation. First, there is evidence that Chiari malformation patients show evidence of allostatic overload. That is, when internal and external stressors go beyond the point that Chiari patients can cope with that in a biological manner, we see a significant drop in estrogen levels. Also, there is clear cognitive dysfunction on multiple domains in Chiari malformation. Also, there are increases in anxiety and depression. There is some evidence that self-focused attention, more self-focused attention, can help Chiari patients to better cope with pain and social isolation, as indexed by memory performance. And pain levels do appear to be correlated with decreasing anterior CSF area in the cervical spine area, at least for older Chiari patients. And brain imaging research in Chiari malformation shows differences in white matter integrity as measured by DTI and functional connectivity as measured by resting state fMRI. In particular, it looks like cognitive dysfunction is associated with hypo or less neural connectivity, and that pain differences in Chiari compared to controls are associated with hyperconnectivity. Thank you.